Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Introduction to Knowledge Translation Evaluation webinar. My name is Diane Duncan, and I am the Program Coordinator of Training and Professional Development for the Alberta SCORE Support Unit Knowledge Translation Platform, and I will be moderating the session today. So I would like to introduce you to our presenter today, Anne Bergen. So Anne is the Director of Knowledge to Action Consulting in Ontario, and she is an evaluation and knowledge mobilization consultant. She spends her time helping academic, nonprofit, and government groups create evaluation frameworks and tools that meet the needs of diverse stakeholders. Anne has particular experience in collaborative evaluation and in evaluating knowledge mobilization and knowledge translation and transfer initiatives. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that the session is being recorded, and the link will be provided along with the presentation slides to all participants after the webinar. The format for today's webinar will be about 40 to 50 minutes of content with time for questions afterward. You can send your questions throughout the presentation by typing them into the chat screen, where they will be addressed by the presenter at the end. I hope you enjoy today's sessions. On behalf of the Alberta SCORE Support Knowledge Translation Platform, I would like to extend a warm welcome to Anne, and will now hand the microphone over to her.
Thanks so much, Diane. So I'm excited to be here today talking to all of you about KT evaluation, and this is an introductory webinar with the idea of providing some basic information and ideas to get you started. So you should know that this presentation is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license, which means you're free to share and reuse it as long as you give me attribution. So what we're going to cover today is first take a look at some basic evaluation terms and concepts. We want to get some of the jargon out of the way and start to look at some of the major kinds of evaluation and the key terms that you would run across if you were doing any kind of evaluation, not just KT evaluation. And then we're going to talk about how evaluation can be used across the KT project lifecycle, or even the KT program or organizational lifecycle. So all the way from planning to impact. And then we're going to wind up by thinking about some barriers and enablers of KT evaluation. So like Diane said, if you have any questions as you're going, type them into the sidebar and we'll address them at the end. Or if I catch them with my eye as you're typing, I might even address them as we go. I should note too that I'm going to be talking about KT evaluation in a lot more depth at the upcoming meta workshops next week. That should say November 22nd and 23rd. And those are in Edmonton. So for those who are able to join us, I look forward to seeing you there. I also have to give you a jargon warning. So we all know that knowledge translation and knowledge mobilization are fields that are full of jargon, and the same is true for evaluation. So jargon can be really helpful. It can help us be really precise about what we're trying to do, but I think it can also build up a lot of unhelpful barriers about exactly what you're doing if you start to get really, really nuanced and rigid in your definitions. So my advice to you when you're working on evaluation in KT or anywhere is to be flexible with your terminology. Try to explain things in plain language whenever possible, and be ready to use different terms in different places. So we're going to start off with a review of basic evaluation terms. If you've taken an evaluation class, this will probably be a review for you. So I think it's important to start by thinking about why we evaluate. What's the purpose of evaluation? Why do we have to evaluate? And what's it good for? So evaluation is about making judgments. And you might make judgments and gather information also in order to make your program better or to facilitate improvements. And evaluation is also useful for generating knowledge. So I think it's interesting. The distinction between research and evaluation is often really, really fine. It can be a bit of a gray area. But I think that what you need to do when you're starting to think about evaluation is to think about what kinds of evidence you're looking for. Because within any given KT project, you could be evaluating and probably should be doing some sort of evaluation all the way through, from before the project to during the project to wrapping up the project. But the intensity of that evaluation and what it looks like depends, like I said, on what kind of evidence you need to collect. So let's say that you're starting out and you've identified a knowledge gap in a particular audience, and you want to design a KT intervention. Well, you might want to do a needs assessment and collect information about what your audience prefers, how they like to get information, how they might be best engaged, what kind of interventions have been tried in the past, and what kinds of interventions might be successful. So this kind of needs assessment could be anything from a literature review to an environmental scan to something that's a little bit more in depth, actually talking to people. And I'll go into some more detail about that in a few slides. If you've actually implemented a KT intervention and you're trying to see how it's going, you would be doing a process evaluation. If you want to see, okay, well, we implemented this intervention, now so what? What happened? Well, that's an outcome evaluation. And so most of the time, what you're doing is together process and outcome evaluation so you can understand the quality of what you're doing and then what happened for people, what were the changes or outcomes. You might also be using evaluation to support learning in a complex initiative. Sometimes evaluation has a very rigidly defined and standardized intervention that you're able to point to. And sometimes things are super emergent and complex and messy. And in those cases, you can turn to techniques from the field of developmental evaluation to help you learn iteratively. So we'll take a little bit of time to delve into these different kinds of evaluation. So needs assessment might also be called capacity assessment, context evaluation, or an environmental scan. All of these are a form of needs assessment. What you're doing is figuring out what the problem is, who cares about the problem, who's involved, what the context is. You're trying to figure out perhaps what the strategy or rationale for your program is, or figuring out if you have enough resources to actually offer a program. So you might start to answer questions like, what's the need being fulfilled by a particular intervention? What are people's goals? Who are the stakeholders? A needs assessment is often very qualitative work. So you're trying to figure out what the context is, what people need, and what people want. And those are things that often involve talking to people and building relationships as you go. So a needs assessment in terms of KT and evaluation can be a great way to engage with your audiences, your end user and stakeholder audiences, right at the beginning of a project. So once you roll out some sort of project or intervention and you want to evaluate how it's going, that's a process evaluation. It might also, you might see it referred to as formative evaluation, implementation evaluation. It could be a form of program audit or monitoring. But basically what you're trying to do is seeing, okay, here's what you said you were going to do. Are you actually doing it? And how is that program being rolled out? So you could look at the quantity and quality of outputs, the things that you're actually producing through the program. You might look at how closely you're implementing something compared to a standardized plan. What a process evaluation does is it tells you how things are going. So if you're not getting the outcomes that you were hoping for, or even if you are getting the outcomes you were hoping for, you have something to point to and say, okay, here's our program, here's how it's going, and here's what we learned for having rolled it out. Outcome evaluation is, I think, what people often think about when they think about evaluation, making decisions, yes or no, did this work? Did the change happen? And so you might also see outcome evaluation referred to as summative evaluation. Sometimes it gets wrapped up with performance measurement or specific techniques like results-based measurement or management rather. So I think overall what outcome evaluation is trying to do is trying to say, okay, here's these activities, we did these activities. Can we associate these activities with outcomes for the people involved? So we would be looking at both short and long-term changes for individuals, organizations, and/or systems. Ideally, in an outcome evaluation, you want to be attentive to what you think is going to happen, but also find ways to capture those unexpected results. An outcome evaluation could have methods ranging anything from super experimental RCTs to contribution analysis to case studies and other qualitative methods. So let's say that you want to use evaluation to learn in a KT project, but you're not quite sure what your intervention is yet. You're not quite sure what's needed. And in fact, there's a lot of unknowns because things are really complicated and just emerging. In that case, you might want to turn to developmental evaluation. I've provided a link there to a website, and Michael Quinn Patton has done a ton of work on this. So that's a name to look up. But basically, the idea is rather than waiting till the end of the project to start to collect evaluation evidence, you collect rapid evaluation evidence as you go and use it for learning. So this is about flexible methods and getting people engaged and building a learning culture. Sometimes it's referred to as just-in-time evidence if you want to be extra jargony. So developmental evaluation could involve things like usability testing, rapid response research, evidence summaries, more informal focus groups, brief surveys, evaluation memos to update people on the project. Those ways of checking in during a project that allow you to change course can all fall under developmental evaluation. So I'm just going to pause now actually and ask after that wave of information if anybody has any questions about these basic ideas in evaluation. Because I think we could wait till the end for everything, but let's do things in a few chunks. It might be a little bit easier to parse it out that way. So type away if you have any questions about these basics. I'll pause briefly, take a sip of water, and then I will get started on the next ideas if I don't see anything. Okay, I see no one typing, so I'm going to assume this is all old hat to most of you, and this is a wonderful review. So then, you will be willing participants in the discussion about logic models, what and why. I won't have to convince you that logic models are awesome because you might already know. So you might have guessed I am a logic model strong proponent. I think they're really, really helpful in organizing evaluation and in organizing projects in general. So what is a logic model? It might also be referred to as a theory of change, but basically what a logic model does is it summarizes what success looks like, how you get from the activities to the expected outcomes and impacts of your project. So what a logic model does is provides a framework for measuring. If you try to take on an evaluation project without a logic model, that might be referred to as a black box evaluation, and that's not a great thing because it means when you're measuring outcomes, you don't know if they're the right outcomes because you don't know how they link back to activities, and you haven't made your program logic or theory of change explicit. Logic models can be developed at the project or program, organization, or even systems level. And the whole idea is to try to make things simple and easy to understand. So even if it's a very complex process, the logic model helps you boil it down so that you can explain something very complex to other people. My next slide is a logic model template for KT that I've adapted from work done by the Canadian Water Network. The Canadian Water Network was a network center of excellence, and now they are a water research management organization. So what they've done is found a way to organize KT at an organizational level. What are the inputs, activities, target audiences, and outcomes that are happening within a funded research program? So in this case, their inputs are staff, user time, partners, equipment, all the things that you need to have to make the program run. I'm also going to talk more about the logic model having a section where you identify necessary conditions for success and assumptions. Not all logic models contain these assumptions, but I think it's really important for KT especially to say, okay, what do we need to have in place for this to happen? And what do we think might work or not work? And how can we test those assumptions? You can also see that the logic model lists out the activities, who's being targeted in the various activities, and you might have more than one end user group. So for example, you might want to get healthcare professionals involved in creating a logic model for a KT intervention, as well as patients and families. Then you can turn to the outcomes of the logic model. So with outcomes, it's easier to divide them partly by time and when the change is supposed to happen, and partly who the change is happening for. So I like to think about short-term outcomes as being changes in the person or individual, in awareness or capacity. Mid-term outcomes are things like behavior or actually making decisions, applying knowledge, and applying capacity. And then you could say long-term impacts are things that are happening over time, contributed to by multiple people, and it's sort of the ultimate goal of what you're doing. You might want to have improved social conditions, or improve the environment, or have an impact on public health. So I'm going to go over these various components in a bit more detail, and then also remember that you're going to have these slides as a reference. You can always go back if this is new information for you. So inputs are often what's quantified, the things that go into a program, but it can also just be a laundry list of the things that you need to get a program going. So if you're very detailed about your inputs, you can use that to do efficiency evaluation. If you're just making a list to understand what you need to get your program started, it's a helpful planning tool. In terms of activities, think about what's being done. Try to be as specific as possible, providing information. And try to avoid words that are fuzzier, like enable. So enabling learning, what does that look like? Providing information in a module online, that's a lot more specific. That's an activity that's easy to say, okay, this has happened or not. Because if you're looking at whether an activity has happened or not, often what you're doing is counting the outputs or products. So these are the tangible and usually quantifiable results of program activities: number of people, number of posters, number of sessions. Typically, outputs are easy to measure, and so often in evaluation, they're all that ends up getting measured. But outputs are not outcomes. So what outputs are doing are measuring the quality of implementation, the process quality, rather than the outcomes and impacts. I find when you're building a logic model, it's really helpful to avoid the inputs and outputs in initial drafts and just focus on what you're doing and what you want to happen, and then build in all the detail later on. Excuse me. So as I noted, short-term outcomes are often changes in knowledge, skills, attitudes, and you want to try to use directional words when you're talking about outcomes. So an increase in awareness, not just awareness. You might want to see things about motivation or attitudes, how people feel about information, how people are motivated to take on new knowledge or to change their behavior. So once you have the knowledge and the capacity, then you can get to the midterm outcome, those changes in behavior and practice as a result of the KT intervention. So you want to make sure that the activities link to the short-term outcomes, which in turn link to the midterm outcomes. And that sounds super obvious, but sometimes when you're in the thick of logic model development, you can overlook things and get in the weeds. And so it's really important to always go back and check, okay, does this make sense? Is it logical? When you're looking at long-term outcomes and impacts, you're thinking about what's happening downstream. These changes are not going to be due to any single intervention or series of interventions. So this is a collective impact that's happening through multiple actors. But what you're saying is this program has attained its short-term outcomes, and it's attained some midterm outcomes too. We can see the changes in awareness, we can see changes in behavior, and then we can start to link those changes in awareness and behavior to those longer-term downstream impacts. So even if you can't measure these long-term impacts directly, sometimes you can collect evidence about those shorter-term outcomes and say, okay, well, here's our logic model, here's the evidence for the shorter-term outcomes, and we expect, if all goes well, these long-term impacts will be happening. When we have more time and money, we'll measure the long-term impacts. And I think that's the thing about impacts, especially in KT. These can take years to happen, and they can be very difficult to attribute to a single cause. So I think you need a lot more research capacity if you're going to be starting to look at long-term impacts. So here again is the logic model. And I wanted to point it up again because we are missing the big part in the bottom left corner about assumptions for success. And this is something that doesn't often fit in this simple column-based logic model. Spelling out assumptions and necessary conditions for success is often referred to as more of a theory of change. You're saying what causes what. If we do this, then that will happen. But I think that a really good practice for KT especially can be just to stick a little bit of assumption in your logic model. You can find some space, put it in somewhere, and get people to start to wrap their brains around what actually has to happen for this intervention to work. Not just saying what you're going to do and what you want to happen, but what needs to be in place for activities to reliably lead to outcomes. So although we're putting all of this into a nice column-based logic model, we know these are all super complex. And what you can do is say, okay, we know it's complex, but we also know that it's easier to read lists if they're presented in columns. So finding a way to balance between the accuracy of presentation of the actual change you're expecting to happen that's going to be bidirectional or multidirectional and reinforce itself in a variety of super complicated ways, and saying, okay, here's a list of things that we expect to happen. We know it's very complicated, but we're going to present it this way so that it's easier to share with other people. Depending on who you're working with, having a lot of arrows looping back and feedback loops may be what you're looking for, or you may want to stick with the more list-based approach. Either way, I think a really great practice is to spell out those assumptions and to say, okay, here's what we think is going to happen. Here's why we think these activities will lead to these outcomes, perhaps based on previous literature or previous work. And also, what do the conditions need to be like for this to work? So I'm going to turn now to thinking about KT evaluation across the KT cycle. So thanks for sticking with me through that long list of definitions. So I think if you boil down a KT project, you can identify 5 basic parts. So first, you're going to have some sort of KT problem, some sort of knowledge gap. You're going to design an intervention, whether that's collecting more information, synthesizing knowledge, or actually having an intervention that goes out to end users. You're going to have to manage the project. You're going to have to evaluate and interpret your results, and then share and use those results. And during the whole thing, ideally, you are engaging with stakeholders, because we know that KT is a social process. And if you try to push out information to people, it's really hard to make them pay attention. So the more you can engage early on, the more successful your KT will be, and the more successful your evaluation will be. So thinking about KT over the lifespan of a evaluation of the lifespan of a KT project, we talked about this a bit already, but you would start with some sort of needs assessment. Even if it's not a formal needs assessment, every KT project starts by defining goals and some sort of problem statement. If you do this more systematically, you can start to call it an actual needs assessment. While you're designing your KT project, you might want to engage in user experience or usability testing. You might want to engage with end users or stakeholders to define a research question. And during the project, you could start to look at the quality and quantity of outputs and people's feedback and carry out process evaluation. Then during the project and at the end, you can start to look at outcomes and impacts and do that outcome evaluation. So you've got a lot of options for evaluation. You could be evaluating everything all the time, so much so that you never actually get any KT work done. So before you delve into this, you really need to boil down what your goals are and think about what aspects of your research or KT you want to evaluate. And almost as importantly, what are you going to do with the resulting information? Evaluation for the sake of learning is great, but it can really burn people out quickly. So unless you have a plan to use that information you're collecting to learn or to change your program, it may not be a good idea to do that evaluation at that time. So remember that evaluation can help you understand the need for KT, the quality of KT, the reach of KT, and the impact of KT. You could start to look at just mapping out the logic of your program and just make a logic model. That could be your deliverable evaluation-wise. You could define what success looks like, and you could start to measure if you're getting to success, or start to understand what works well in different contexts. But again, you need to figure out what parts of the KT process you're trying to evaluate. Another way to break it down is to think about the continuum from knowledge creation to impact. So at the beginning, we, loosely speaking, have knowledge creation. Somebody's creating some form of knowledge, and they're sharing that knowledge and engaging with other people. Those other people take on the new knowledge, and then ideally they'll use it, and that use will have an impact. The further along you're trying to measure, the harder it is. It's quite easy to count how much knowledge was created or to track that. Dissemination and engagement is a little bit harder, especially once things get out there in the world. Then uptake, that's hard. How do you know if people have taken on your information? You could count downloads, but then what about use? How do you know if people are using your information? You'd have to talk to them. And more than that, how do you know if that use had an impact? Well, you're going to have to track a lot of things over time and do some careful qualitative investigation. So you could say, okay, well, is my KT effective? Again, I think it's really important to boil that down. So what kind of impact or effect are you looking for? When? Is this effective right away? That you've succeeded at dissemination and got a whole lot of posters and brochures up there? Or are you looking at later downstream impact on actual behavior or, say, actual health status, those longer term or ultimate goals? You might want to say, okay, who's the impact happening for, under what conditions, and based on what evidence? I think in KT, an ongoing problem is lack of resources for evaluation and lack of capacity. So often what we want to do is be able to make a lot of great statements about how impact is happening and for whom and under what conditions and all these things, but we don't have the resources to actually do this in any realistic way. So one way to think about how many resources are going to be required when you're planning an evaluation project is to think about the complexity of what you're trying to measure. So I like to break down that performance measurement at most is going to look at short-term outcomes. Performance measurement is something you're doing yearly for accountability reasons to make sure that you're doing what you said you were going to do in your plan, that you're performing, you're doing KT work, and that it's happening. You can't measure people's behavior and policy change and decisions and impacts on a yearly basis. That takes a lot more measurement time and a lot more complexity and is better suited to projects that are specifically thought of as research and program evaluation. And as you get down to causal attribution, so not just that the change happened, being able to pinpoint, okay, this change happened due at least in part to this specific activity, that becomes quite labor intensive and needs a lot more planning. So on that note, the ideas of planning and resource, we're going to turn now to thinking about barriers and enablers of KT evaluation. So I think first, it's important to think about the whole evaluation process. With evaluation, often you do a little bit at the proposal stage. You say, oh yes, we're going to evaluate. Here's what it's going to look like. Here's how we're going to collect data. And then you start implementing the project and evaluation falls by the wayside until the final report stage. That's a bit of a worst case scenario, but I think what evaluation should be doing is being one mechanism of engagement with your stakeholders and your end users in the KT project. So ideally in evaluation, you're not starting alone, you're starting with other people, because if you build a logic model explaining the logic of your program all by yourself, it could be the best model ever, but you're going to have to do a lot more work to get the buy-in from your colleagues that this model actually makes sense. If you can get your stakeholders involved from the beginning in the logic model creation process, it's going to be a lot easier. You want to decide on some sort of general goal or focus and intended use. And then also think about not just who's involved in creating the logic model and creating, say, the KT intervention, who are the stakeholders in that, but who are your eventual audiences? Who are you trying to mobilize the knowledge to? And are they different than the stakeholders that might be involved in creating the evaluation framework? So for example, you might think about creating the logic model with healthcare providers and a patient advisory group, and then the actual intervention is going to be rolled out broadly to the public or some subset of the public. Defining specific evaluation questions then leads into defining your methods. So what are you going to do? Does this look like an RCT? Are you doing some surveys? Do you have any sort of open-ended qualitative questions? What are you using for indicators? How are you going to collect the data? Spelling all of this out ahead of time, just like for any research project, makes your life a lot easier. You're going to collect the data, analyze, reflect on results, and share what you learned, and then use the evaluation results. So I think for all of you that are researchers already, this is not a new process. This is your daily work. And so think of evaluation like that too. It's a form of research, but a form of research that needs to be used right away, either for program improvement, for learning, or for making decisions about what's working and what's not working. Figuring out what those uses need to be is why you need to get your stakeholders involved from the beginning. If you want to make a KT evaluation framework, there are a lot of great templates out there. So some common components that you would need would be a logic model or theory of change. Once again, I urge you to list your assumptions around necessary conditions for success. Definitely spell out what your evaluation goals or research questions are, and figure out how you're going to engage with your audience and end users. Be specific about that. Don't just hope that it's going to happen. You want to define your measurement methods and indicators, your data analysis plan, and how the evaluation will be used. So this could be anything from a one-page outline to like a 20-page detailed document. How much information you need in the evaluation framework depends on how many people are going to use it and how detailed of an evaluation you need. You also want to start from any project thinking about how you're going to deal with these really common KT evaluation tensions, and there are no easy answers to these ones. So first, if you think about the timing of outcomes and impacts, you may have funding to do the evaluation as the project is closing and say 6 months later, but the impacts might take several years to unfold. So getting everyone on the same page and getting common expectations about what's possible in terms of measuring outcomes and impacts is really important. If you want to see those longer term downstream impacts, you need to know that it's going to take more time and also a larger KT intervention. If you have some tiny project and you're trying to see a giant impact later on down the line, it's probably not going to be possible. You also have to think about finding the balance between success stories and quantified impact. I think a lot of funders and other people would like to be able to quantify the impact of KT interventions, and sometimes that's possible, especially in healthcare settings. But sometimes KT evaluation is about building success stories, saying, okay, we did this thing, it was really great, it worked. Somewhere in between, there's, I think, a space for critical evaluation that is still qualitative, but doesn't try to put a number on everything. So making sure when you're doing KT evaluation that it's not just an exercise in patting yourself on the back and demonstrating success, but also being reflective about what the lessons learned were and why things worked. So making the evaluation information as useful as possible for future people who are going to do similar work. The kinds of KT evaluation you do for emerging versus established research areas can be really different. So if you have something that's very new, it's groundbreaking, the evaluation of that research impact will be very different than if you're looking at something that is a 20-year research program and trying to evaluate the research impact of that program. Another common tension is agreeing among partners on what you should measure and when. Whether you're going to have the time and money to actually collect data. Usually you're short on both time and money, and often you don't have the people in place to do the analysis and reporting. So if your team doesn't have somebody who has a bit of a history with evaluation, maybe find somebody that you can consult with in another area. Find out what might be likely in terms of what will be required to get the work done, and make sure what you're going to do is actually feasible. The interesting thing I think about evaluating is that it can be really tense for people because you're deciding whether the thing that they're putting a lot of time and effort into is working or not. And I think that if you can engage with the people actually delivering a program to do the evaluation, you can get a lot more buy-in and learn-in versus saying, okay, I'm an arm's length evaluator, I will be judging you. So thinking about those political constraints in what you're doing can be really helpful, as well as just the basic resource constraints like time, money, people, etc. Thinking about who might not want to hear the results of the evaluation, who might be paying attention, what the intended use is, what the reporting requirements are. All of those are things that you want to look at the beginning of your project to make sure that what you're collecting and doing evaluation-wise is what's actually needed and wanted. You need to make sure that your evaluation questions and methods are a good fit for your context. You may want to do a really rigorous outcome evaluation, but if you have $5,000 and 6 months, it's just not going to happen. So be realistic about what you can learn with the resources and time and context that you have. excuse me. I think it's also, for those of us working in a more academic context, really important to spell out whether you're doing evaluation research or evaluation research, capital R research, because one of those, if it's researchy enough, may end up going through an ethics review board. It'll be published. It's just another form of inquiry that takes place in a scholarly setting. But other forms of evaluation research are not scholarly research. There's something different. They're aimed at program improvement. They're smaller. They're probably funded differently. And they may have more practical than theoretical considerations. One place I like to start with evaluation that makes it a little bit easier are the 5 basic questions that John Lavis described. So what research knowledge was transferred? To whom was the research knowledge transferred? By whom was it transferred? How and with what effect? Any one of these could be a KT evaluation. And if you are able to answer all 5 questions, you've got a really comprehensive KT evaluation across the life cycle of your project. So I'm going to wind up with a few tips and tricks for evaluation. So first of all, get the right people involved. Don't try to do this on your own. Leverage your connections. Find flexible evaluation expertise. Get people engaged and excited about the evaluation work and what can be learned from it. I think it's really important to choose indicators carefully. There's an urge often to try to measure everything. But once you have too much data, it's just overwhelming. So don't try to measure everything and don't overpromise what your data can show. If you're measuring retweets, say, as a marker of engagement, that's great. But don't say that retweets are actually going to lead to outcomes. You would need more evidence to demonstrate that. Think about the data collection burden on your team and on participants. Validated measures are awesome, but they can often be really lengthy. So finding that balance between having measures that people will actually fill out and will collect a quality of data that's as rigorous as you need it is really helpful. And again, having a plan for using the data you collect, KT for your KT data, is super important. So I think overall planning ahead, being flexible, and being persistent is what you need in KT evaluation. So some resources for you to take a look at. The Better Evaluation website is awesome. There's the Knowledge Mobilization Toolkit, and Sarah Morton's work on contribution analysis is a lovely way of looking at impact. So now it's time to turn to questions. Type up your questions, and I will answer them.
Oh, hi, Anne. I see on the screen there's a question about contribution analysis. Can you just touch on that briefly?
Yeah, for sure. So contribution analysis says that we want to look at impact, but we know that the impact is caused by many things. So what we want to do is map how our particular initiative contributed to the larger impact. What you do is start with a logic model or theory of change, figuring out how you're getting from activities to impact, and then you start to gather evidence about each stage of the journey. You're testing your assumptions and necessary conditions for success. You're collecting information about the various levels of outcomes, and you're tying it all together in a cohesive story. So that Sarah Morton reference has a lovely example of that. And you can also look at John Mayne, Mayne. He's a Canadian evaluator.
That's super helpful. I find that very interesting. So there's another question about developmental evaluation. Is it different than process evaluation?
Yes. And it's hard to say exactly how. So I think there's a lot of overlap in the various methods, but what developmental evaluation does is, I think, helps you collect information when you don't know quite what the process is supposed to look like. So it could help you guide implementation, and that way it could be very, very much like a process evaluation. But if it's something that's being used, say, to collect evidence about how collaborators are engaged in a project together, and then feed that back to them so they can improve their own practice and do all of that within the span of, say, a couple months rather than a whole year. That would feel more like developmental evaluation to me. On the Better Evaluation website, if you look up developmental evaluation there's a table that says this is developmental evaluation and this is traditional evaluation. I have to say, the way they frame it, it seems like almost everything is actually developmental evaluation, but I like to refer to it most often when it's a complex situation and things are emerging, as opposed to more of a standardized intervention.
That's really helpful.
So I'm looking at the questions now. Oh, good.
Yeah.
How do you measure the impact for end users of translated knowledge products when you are told that these users are surveyed to death? Well, don't give them another survey because they're just not going to fill it out unless you do something first to build up their goodwill. So that could be having some sort of event where you feed them and make them feel good about themselves, and then you survey them. You could provide incentives for the survey, which can get expensive very quickly. Or you could start to rely on methods other than surveying, like interviews or focus groups that people might be more likely to respond to. But I think once you've got to a place where your end users are at survey saturation, it's really hard to overcome that without waiting a little bit. Also, designing better surveys. I think that we've all filled out surveys that are just horrible to fill out and surveys that are pretty quick and easy. So if you can boil down your questions to something that takes like 15 seconds to respond to, you're going to get better uptake.
Okay, so I'll encourage people to
Any
keep
other questions out
typing in
there?
questions. I actually had a question, Anne. What are the risks of bias in evaluation, and how do you mitigate those risks? Because if you're doing an internal evaluation, for a KT intervention, a lot of times how the results are reported, can vary depending on who's, doing the evaluation. So can you just speak briefly to, what are some of the risks of unintentional bias, and how do you try and mitigate those risks?
I think that that's an awesome question. Um, what I like to do is use multiple methods of collecting outcome data. So using mixed methods can be really helpful because if you have a little bit of survey data, maybe some pre-post, or and then getting people to reflect qualitatively and collecting information from multiple target audiences, maybe the people who are offering the program and the people involved, having multiple information sources can reduce the bias. If the evaluator themselves are super biased because they really want to see a program succeed, um, there's of course a huge risk that they're going to write up the report just in a self-serving way. And I think that's where not necessarily formal peer review, but review by an advisory committee or a funding committee or some sort of other body can help say, hey, you didn't provide a lot of evidence for this claim. Can you back that up a little bit? And that can be helpful. So having review by external parties also can be a way to do that. I think also just declaring your biases up front and being more open about that, saying, I have a vested interest in this program. I want to see it succeed. Here are some ways that we're going to try to reduce bias. Um, in general, though, the traditional way of trying to reduce bias is to get an arm's length evaluator that doesn't know anyone. And that can work, but it can also create a lot of hard feelings because then you do a really old fashioned method of evaluation where stakeholders aren't engaged. So it's tricky that way, I think. But overall, figuring out where the biases might be, reflecting on them as a team, and getting layers of review and making sure that you've done all of those quality research things that you would do for any project are ways to get around the bias.
Thanks, that's super helpful. So any more questions?
Oh, I had one more thought
Sure.
too. One more thought about bias, which would be that finding ways to provide unpleasant information to your funder or your management and preparing them for that ahead of time, because not all projects work. So if you know that you're doing an evaluation and things aren't working as planned, getting those people ready for the lessons learned rather than the glowing success story. And finding ways to talk about how excellent the lessons were and how useful can reduce that inclination to just frame everything in a really sunny way.
Well, and speaking from personal experience, I think that a lot of times it's when things maybe don't go as planned that those lessons learned are actually, great learning opportunities and help to inform the next project to
Yeah.
make it that much more successful.
Yeah, I think so. I think so for sure. In fact, reading an evaluation where everything went super well is fine, but it's where things went a little bit off track and people got it back on track and figuring out how they did that. That's the super interesting part for me.
Yes, I would agree. So just while we're waiting for more questions, I think it would be helpful maybe for you to spend a few minutes just chatting more about the workshops that you're going to be delivering in Edmonton on the 22nd and the 23rd, because I think this is a huge area of interest for a lot of people in the KT world. And so, if you could just spend a few minutes talking about these workshops, I think it would be very helpful to our audience.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, this webinar was the primer to the workshops. But in the workshops first, I want to cover how to create a logic model for KT evaluation. So going through some examples, some things to keep in mind, some tips for working together on logic model creation, and then going through and actually creating a logic model together as a group, which is one of those things until you've done it a few times, it's hard to do. But once you've actually done it, it becomes a lot easier. I think it's a skill-based knowledge that way. And then we're going to start the fun process of figuring out indicators and methods for KT evaluation. So, you have a logic model, you have a problem or evaluation question you want to answer. How are you actually going to go about doing that? So starting to think about what's possible, what are some of the trade-offs, what are some things that are commonly used, and how can you document all this if you're making an evaluation plan? So yeah, the registration for that is up on the screen. If you happen to be in Edmonton next week, you should sign up.
Yeah, and I will speak to the value of logic models. I, first learned about them, I guess, about 18 months ago, and they're incredibly valuable just in helping you think about, how you're going to design programs and projects. So very helpful. And I completely agree that you have to really work through them in a pragmatic way to understand, how they work and how they can benefit your program. So I would like to put a plug in for that because they are incredibly valuable. So I'm just looking at the time. We've got about 12 minutes. So are there any other burning questions out there? Because Anne has a ton of
Oh,
experience.
somebody's typing. Excellent. Do you have any suggested resources for creating a logic model? Good question. I think that if I recall correctly, there's a community toolbox out there that has an awesome step-by-step for creating a logic model, and that might be hosted through the University of Wisconsin. But if you Google Community Toolbox Logic Model, it should pop up. Um, Overall, I think the process for me is starting as in person as possible, or at least synchronous audio and video, and starting with something like stickies or a mind map and being very brainstormy about what's possible, and then going through several iterations of condensing it. Because what you want to do is really, really be open to all the possible activities and outcomes, and then you look for the themes in them and boil it way down again so that it basically all fits on one page. When there is pushback from stakeholders on evaluation methods, any thoughts on getting to consensus? Another awesome question. So this is a big one. Often people aren't happy with what evaluation methods are happening, especially if they weren't very involved in the development or if they were involved, but then the context changed. So I think that it's important to value people's time when they're filling out the evaluation. And if it's that you have stakeholders that aren't happy with the quality of the measures or the methods for whatever reason, finding ways to talk about that. And if there's anything mitigation wise that can be done in terms of making the methods answer the questions that they're looking for, or getting on sort of those common expectations about what's possible with the methods that are at hand. If people feel like the whole methods are a huge burden on them, that they have no time, and that the evaluation is going to take over their whole life, I think it's really important to listen to those concerns, Because if you don't, then you end up with potato quality data because nobody does the work anyway. So it's about any sort of conflict management process, about people being heard, starting to come up with solutions together about what might be possible in terms of compromise, and really talking it through as much as possible and letting people's voices be heard. Because I think imposing measurement and evaluation on people can be a really upsetting process. And it's important to recognize that and to value people's time and expertise and thoughts and the whole thing.
So I have a question. I think
So time and snacks, I would say. Sorry, go ahead.
so I have a question. Ideally, we're all planning for evaluation at the beginning of a project, but typically that doesn't happen, from what I've experienced. So what do you do? Like, what are some strategies when all of a sudden, it's at the end of the project and it's like, oh, we have to evaluate this? Because again, it's much easier if you build evaluation from the front end, but often that doesn't happen. So how do you, kind of deal with that situation, which occurs frequently, where all of a sudden it's like, okay, now we have to evaluate. It's the end of the project.
Yeah, for sure. I think that you can go through the same stages as you would with any evaluation. You just have to do them near the end. So you're still going to build some sort of logic model, ideally, um, but you might be doing it more around what results you've already produced and what you know happened rather than what you expected to happen. And you could even annotate that in the logic model, saying, here, we thought this was going to happen, but this is unexpected. So the logic model provides a bit of an evaluation itself of how the program rolled out. And then I think finding ways to collect information as pragmatically as possible, with what's possible, right? So if you can't talk to people, if all you can do is look at uptake or maybe social media or downloads, then talking about that as a limitation of the evaluation, but also working with that information that you have. Um, Often also when you have to do things right at the end, you can find ways to send out those surveys and um, questions to partners that get a little bit at the quality of the project and a little bit about the outcomes of the project. And hopefully, no matter what, you've been tracking your outputs all along so that you can put into the evaluation, even if you haven't done a ton of stuff at the beginning. And I think that's why we often end up with output focused evaluations, is because it's the thing that people tend to have already information wise.
Okay, thanks. So I think, it's some great discussion, great questions, and it looks like we're not having any more questions coming through right now. So I'm going to give everyone a gift of time of about 5 minutes back, but I just want to, again, thank you, Anne, for such an amazing presentation. I learned a lot. And thank you to all the webinar participants who joined us today. And again, this session has been recorded, and the link to view the webinar will be emailed to all the registered participants. And again, I would really like to encourage you to attend the workshops in Edmonton if you would like to learn more about KT evaluation, and the link is up there. So on behalf of the Alberta SPOR Knowledge Translation Platform, I'd like to wish everyone a great day. And again, thank you, Anne, one more time. And I hope that we will see you in Edmonton soon, and you have a gift of 5 minutes coming back into your day. Thanks.
Thanks so much.